Hello, everyone. I'd like to talk a little bit more about stigma. Everyone has heard the expression, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. And I doubt that anyone really believes this is entirely true. Names are not only hurtful and potentially destructive in perpetuating misinformation, but they also create an unwelcoming, if not hostile, attitude toward those suffering from mental illness. A major theme running through the course is really about this representation of mental illness in mainstream film. And it's very important to think about that notion of stigma and how often these representations have been quite negative. It may not be entirely fair to blame the negative portrayal of individuals with mental illness on the filmmakers themselves. It's really easy to find comments in our everyday language that support negative stereotypes of people suffering from mental illness. Take a minute and think about how many slang terms you can come up with that are used to refer to somebody who might be a little mentally unstable. Some come to mind. Some of the ones that are pretty commonly in use, the mentally ill are often referred to as nuts, psycho, having a screw loose, maybe the lights are on but nobody's home, a few bricks short of a load, weirdo, loony, freaky, disturbed, cray-cray, wacko, demento, and the list goes on. Now think about how many slang terms you know for an individual with diabetes, with a heart condition, with cancer. Other than some gallows humor that some of us might have experienced in some of the higher stress environments, I remember working in the ER, burn victims were sometimes referred, however disrespectfully, as crispy critters, and we still hear a lot about the frequent flyers. However, no single condition generates more derogatory terminology in our common everyday language than mental illness. So we talk about the way in which film stigmatizes the mentally ill, but it might also be useful to explore exactly what do we mean by stigma if our goal is to eliminate it. First, those diagnosed as mentally ill are more likely to be victim of violence than a perpetrator. So those films that portray the individual as the homicidal maniac, quote unquote, are inaccurate. Often the mentally ill live in poverty and are homeless. They're often the victims of bullying rather than being the bullies. However, they're often perceived as dangerous, and this makes justifying coercive treatment more likely. Clearly, they also face discrimination and prejudice in the workplace. But stigma is more than name-calling. One definition from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is stigma is the relationship between an attribute and a stereotype that assigns undesirable traits, labels, qualities, and behavior in a person. There are different types of stigma, and I'd like to talk about them because they really have very different implications. The first type of stigma is structural stigma. And these are societal level conditions, cultural norms, and institutional practices that constrain the opportunities, resources, and well-being for stigmatized populations. So what does this mean exactly? This institutionalizes discrimination against the mentally ill through policy, legislation, and film and news coverage. For example, insurance companies that do not offer adequate coverage for those with mental illness. Rental policies that restrict rentals to those with a history of mental illness. Lack of funding for supportive housing that increases the likelihood of homelessness. In some states, those with psychiatric histories face the loss of child custody. They can't vote, they can't hold office. And there are also disincentives for the mentally ill to seek vocational rehabilitation, since those who are receiving funds through Social Security disability don't really have any motive to find work because they are then faced with the loss of benefits, which often involves the loss of their medication as well, so they're stuck. Public stigma is another form of stigma. These are the negative attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors held within a community or the larger cultural context that are referred to collectively as negative social norms. So dominant mainstream North American society generally holds fairly negative attitudes, and this often translates into discrimination or poor treatment. In some cultures, individuals with mental illness, with, say, for example, auditory hallucinations, may be seen as blessed or having some special powers, but in dominant mainstream North American society, they're kind of seen as pariahs much of the time. Even those working in healthcare, it has been found, may treat those with mental illness less thoughtfully and respectfully than they treat clients with medical conditions. So if the general public holds these negative stereotypes, there are fewer inhibitions for anyone else to treat those individuals with mental illness, with care. Self-stigma. This is the internalization of public stigma by the person with the mental illness or substance abuse disorder. For example, the person with mental illness internalizes or self-labels themselves. And so they see this negative opinion of people like them in the broader culture. And they then take on that negative identity. When the risk of identification is associated with so many losses, in other words, when the risk of self-disclosure of having a mental illness is associated with this kind of negative response from the broader culture, it's no wonder people are reluctant to label behaviors as mental illness, either their own symptoms or a family members. And so this denial of symptoms may lead to a worsening of their condition, and certainly at least a lack of treatment. Courtesy, stigma, and label avoidance are interesting phenomena as well. Label avoidance kind of goes along with that notion that we're not going to seek treatment because by seeking treatment we get a diagnosis or a label, and in many cases people, rather than taking on that identity, self-isolate and fear situations where there may be some risk of self-disclosure. For example, a job interview where they have to explain gaps in their employment when perhaps they were psychiatrically hospitalized. Courtesy stigma, these negative attitudes are extended to families and friends of the mentally ill individual, so that people will isolate the whole family of a mentally ill member in addition to that mentally ill person themselves. And it's interesting that this can extend to providers. You may find that those who serve lower status groups, not only the mentally ill, but the elderly and who work with children, often get paid less and have lower status within their own professional disciplines. So what factors contribute to this increase in negative stigma associated with mental illness? Some of the perceptions are that of perceived dangerousness, and that's probably really number one. People are fearful, and that goes hand in hand with the unpredictability, that we know what to expect in social situations from each other, and there's this perception that if someone is mentally ill, that they don't hold to our accepted social norms, which is certainly not always the case. Lack of exposure, so lack of contact and regular experience interacting with people with mental illness can perpetuate these stereotypes. Lack of knowledge and understanding of the origins of the condition, so not understanding why people become mentally ill and not understanding it, many of the mental illnesses as really brain disorders rather than some problem with their personality or moral fiber. What are evidence-based strategies for reducing stigma? People have found that educating the public and educating individuals and their families are key elements in reducing the negative stereotypes. Exposure and routine interaction, when you get to know people, get to understand them, and that accepting that all behavior has meaning, that it might not be obvious to you initially, but through this consistent interaction, Getting to know people makes them much more understandable. Advocacy, that if this is a group that may not have as loud a voice, but groups like NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, can advocate for policies, for legislation, for media representations that counter some of these negative stereotypes. Again, public awareness and letting the broader public know about resources, helping engage people with mental illnesses in the community are certainly key steps. And peer support groups, so that those individuals are not feeling quite so isolated or alone with their problem. Okay. There's an interesting website, The Truth in Nursing, I believe, is the title, and I'll try to find the link, where nurses are scanning the media. Their focus at the moment seems to be on television. I guess Netflix is producing a show called Nurse Ratched, and they're very concerned about the image of nurses in the media. So this might be something to take a look at that you might find interesting as well, because Nurse Ratched is sort of the prototypic evil psychiatric nurse that I'm sure you'll be reading more about in the articles that are assigned in the class.